the low maintenance garden because I take a lot of calls from the public. I take the calls from the non-commercial calls. So the commercial growers go to the ag agent and I answer all the calls that are not that. So that can be garden clubs, that can be residents, that can be just avid gardeners, homeowners, general public. And people are frequently
Can I
asking
hear it
for
now?
low maintenance um, garden, for asking for, I want to have a garden, but I don't want to spend a lot of time taking care of it. And so it's an interesting conundrum because I think the information's a little confusing, and that's where the title of this came from, the myth of the low maintenance garden, because any living organism that grows is going to do things that you didn't expect to happen. And so it really is a myth that having a garden is a low maintenance prospect, but there are strategies and plants placed in the right place that are going to actually require less work from you than making other choices. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's look at, here's how I've laid out what we're going to do. First, we're going to use Lisa's definitions of what constitutes low and high maintenance. Then we'll debunk a couple of common low maintenance gardening myths. What I did when I was interested in this talk was I went online and I said, hey, if I type in low maintenance gardening, what are the types of hints and tips that I'm getting from common things that come up on the internet? Let's take a look at what those things are and whether or not in reality they're going to work out the way people anticipate them. Then we'll go to recommendations that I know for sure, best practices that work. And then we can get to some actual plant choices or plants that are easier to place and more reliable choices than some plants have really specific needs that makes them harder to keep happy. So let's go to the hardworking choices. So first, I'm going to loosely define, this is not a scientific definition, this is more the way people who are talking to me on the phone would define low and high maintenance landscape chores. Most people, when I'm talking to them on the phone, are not really thinking about the time that they input into mowing the lawn. They take that as a given, that's required. And when they're talking about high maintenance chores, they're talking about things that are difficult to do, physically going to take a lot of energy and or a lot of time. So those tasks would be things that you need to dig or rake or haul things. Some ideas of that would be planting or transplanting large plants, mulching large beds, fall leaf cleanup, dividing a lot of perennials that have outgrown their space, taking care of pruning plants that are overhanging your walkways. These are, to them, high maintenance chores. So low maintenance chores are things that don't require that much effort, that you don't have to change your clothes to go do. And for some people are pleasant chores, like I don't know about you, but I like to water.
Yeah, we just on stop on the road.
I like my hose. I like the little different watering wands. I don't find that to be a chore that I dread having to do because it's not going to take a lot of time and I can be out in the garden and enjoying that. So lighter tasks are not as difficult tasks to physically necessarily. So when I went and looked online as to what the internet is giving for tips for, low maintenance, here's their low maintenance common recommendations that came up. And the first one was to reduce the size of your lawn. I think the premise on that is because homeowners spend the most amount of time on lawn mowing overall, that if you reduce the size of your lawn, that's less time mowing and therefore that's less maintenance chores. The reality is if you have a 2-acre lawn and you reduce it down to a half an acre, that's absolutely true, right? Because that's less time that you're going to spend mowing. But if you have a half an acre lawn and you put a planting in that's maybe 20 by 10 feet, that's not really going to give you that much time back, that you don't have to mow that little 20 by 10 foot strip, that it actually is going to reduce the time that you're spending in your garden. So, and what are you putting in its place? You could actually put something in the lawn's place that requires more maintenance chores on your part than mowing the lawn did. So this is sort of a myth to a degree. Commonly, it'll say, oh, reduce your lawn, and that reduces your time spent having to do chores, but that's only true if you have a really large lawn and that you can reduce it by turning some of it over to meadow, and then you're only mowing that once a year. So that's a common recommendation, and I think commonly doesn't apply to most homeowners. The next common recommendation that was made was add perennials in place of annuals. The thinking is that you plant the plant once and it lives many years. That's what perennial means, is multiple years. And it'll flower many years so that you're reducing your planting chores. The reality is you're actually trading off chores. Perennial flowers, most perennials will flower between 3 to 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a very long time to get flower power out of a perennial plant. And after that, many of them are rather exhausted from the task and don't look their best. So you then would have to have like this border on the left-hand side when you see all these beautiful perennial plants. That was very well designed. You have to plant things that are going to flower in succession. You can't put one perennial plant in. You have to pick one that that flowers in the spring, another for your summer, another for your fall. Keep in mind they're at their best for maybe 3 weeks, so you kind of need early spring, early summer, late summer, early fall, late fall to have that kind of constant show of flowers. Annual plants, on the other hand, live a year. Their whole life cycle starts and ends in a year. So that means in order for their species to survive, they will flower like no other plant out there. They are trying to produce as many flowers as possible so that they have as many seeds as possible so that their species has a chance to grow again the following year. So because of that, annual plants will produce flowers. A single annual plant will produce a continuous amount of flowers that no perennial can compete with, right? So they just do not function the same way. And they're a single plant that's going to do that flowering from the spring straight through until it gets too cold for them to flower anymore. So they don't really replace each other. They don't really function the same way. Perennial plants also, at the end of the season now, their energy will go down into their roots. The roots are still alive, but all the herbaceous material that's above the ground now will be dead plant material that you need to do something with. So whether you leave it standing through the winter for the birds to eat the seeds off through the winter, and you cut it back in the spring, or you cut it back in the fall because you like it to look clean after it's all gone dormant, it still is giving you that task of having to clean up that herbaceous material. Whereas with an annual plant, it's done and over with, and you're not having to deal so much with so much leftover herbaceous material. Annuals well placed in certain places, focal points are just a smaller area to have to attend to. So it's not really true that a perennial plant can be used like an annual. So planting it and forgetting it is, there's still going to be more chores that go on with that. So that's not necessarily going to work out the way it seems in the first place. The next recommendation, believe it or not, that came up was, oh, if you have a high traffic area, instead of trying to mow it, put in a gravel path. Now, while gravel does stand up better to foot traffic than grass, the truth of the matter is there are lots of plants that like growing in gravel. Anyone who has a gravel pathway can tell you that. So you're not actually going to reduce the amount of seeds that are going to germinate if you put in a gravel pathway. You're now swapping chores again. Instead of mowing your lawn, you're going to have to do weed management in a gravel path. I also like this particular picture because it's bringing also to the forefront a couple of deals. Other situations that a gravel path is going to cause for you. You want to keep the gravel contained. So you can see in that picture there's edging material, and then you can see that the plants don't respect the edging material. They keep growing They grow over the edging material, and now you have a pruning circumstance of can I prune that plant to keep it on its side of the edging material, or do I have to move the edging material to accommodate the maturity and growth of the plant? So gravel does handle more foot traffic, but there are lots of plants that are really suited to growing well in rocky soils. I have a plant that actually prefers to pop up in my gravel rather than back in the plant bed that I'd like it to grow in. It's just because in its native habitat, it grows in rocky soils that dry quickly and it likes it there. So don't think that gravel is a difficult place for plants to live. And if you put in a gravel path, then you're going to have this tidy, English garden gravel path look. There is chores that go along with caring for that path to keep it clean. Plants can grow very well in gravel, so keep that in mind. Even if you put down landscape fabric to begin with, organic matter lands on top, and the plant seeds land on top, and they will grow. Plants can grow everywhere. There is a plant adapted to grow everywhere. Another common recommendation is place a layer of mulch down, and that's going to solve all your weed problems. Weeds are just not going to live there. And that all depends on how well the mulch is being tended and utilized. So while mulch can suppress weed seeds from germinating, it's not a once and done task. And it's a heavy task. It's a difficult chore. In my yard, every 3 years, I get about 10 yards of mulch. That's a lot of mulch, and that's a lot of trips with my wheelbarrow and my mulch pitchfork to put it down and to lay it down properly in the right locations so that it works well. Improperly applied mulch actually can damage trees and shrubs. It creates, if you're piling it against the base of the trunk or the base of the stem on a shrub, it will keep the stem moist. When the bark is moist, it doesn't do its job. Bark is the armor for the plant. It keeps things out. When it's soft, then it's easy for insects and diseases to get into the tree or the shrub. So mulch has a very specific best practice way to use it. It is a good idea to use it when you're using it properly, but it is not going to stop you from having to weed, and it is not an easy task to do on a regular basis. If you do have mulch applied, make sure that you're actually loosening it up twice a year to make sure that it's doing its job. Mulch can actually create a crust, and then the water runs off of it. It actually gets this negative charge on it, and it sheds water instead of helping to keep the water in the soil and keeping the soil moist. So it does require care. It does require attention, and it should not be overused. Too much mulch is a bad thing. It suffocates roots, and it does not help the circumstance. It looks like when you see it out in a lot of commercial applications, unfortunately, they mound it right against the base of the tree. It looks like a volcano. It looks like, yay, then I won't have to weed whack. But the reality is that is so damaging to the tree that it can cause the death of the tree. It's just that people won't necessarily correlate why the tree died to that, because it takes many years for that to cause a problem. But it is actually a misapplication. It should be used like donuts, not volcanoes. You need to be able to see the base of the tree, the flare of the tree where it stretches out to where the roots are. It is not good for the tree for it to be there. So properly placed mulch is useful, but I don't think it's a low maintenance task, and it's not going to work the way people think it as a once and done sort of circumstance. So those were the top 4. This is how you make your garden a low maintenance garden. Suggestions when I just went in and generally asked the internet to tell me what are your top hits. Here's my suggestions for a replacement on that. All right, so I sort of debunked what those said, and here's where we're going to come back and make the suggestions of best practices for things that actually do work. The lowest maintenance garden as an ornamental around your house a property is to properly select and place trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs who are chosen right plant for the right place, left growing in their natural form, are going to be the least amount of time and attention to maintain. The foliage of trees and shrubs shade out competition. There aren't as many weeds to contend with. It's easier to understand what's a weed when what's in your bed is a tree or a shrub, woody plants. When you have herbaceous plants growing down at the bottom, it's hard to know what's a weed and what's something that you planted there or you want to leave growing there. So beds and borders that are tree and shrub bed and borders are really the lowest maintenance type of ornamental planting that you can use. Now, the important thing here is properly selected and placed trees and shrubs. Not every tree will grow well in every soil or every amount of sunlight or the moisture level that's naturally going to come to that tree in that space on your property. Things that are really important to understand is the amount of sunlight, the amount of moisture, the type of soil you have, and the topography of where you're planting it. A plant that likes extra water is a great plant to put that's going to be in the feed from your downspout. That just allows you to put a plant there that automatically likes that extra drink, and it's an advantage. But you would not want to put a plant near your downspout that hails from the Mediterranean growing in gravelly soils. You will drown it and it will be done for. So understanding what we call the cultural requirements of the plant, where the plant grows naturally, what its habitat is like there, and then seeing if you have a place in your property that matches that is how you're going to have a happy plant. I oftentimes hear people talk about how native plants are better adapted, and that's actually only true if the site conditions of your property match the site conditions that the native plant grows in naturally. So any plant, it doesn't matter if it's native to our continent or it's a non-native plant, any plant that your site conditions match its cultural requirements for where it grows in its natural habitat, though it's the match of those two things that make it grow well in your yard. It's not where the plant hails from. It's the fact that you have acidic, sandy soil and the plant hails from a place where it grows for hundreds of thousands of years over evolution in acidic, sandy soils, right? It's making that match that makes the plant successful on your property. So that means you're going to have to understand what your soil is like, what kind of pH your soil has, and the texture of your soil, the amount of moisture that comes there, and also how much light is that plant growing in. It's those connections and match of that is the really important thing there. Once you've got that down, now you have a plant that is well suited to grow in the site, and a site that is well suited for what that plant needs. That's how you're going to have lower maintenance because the plant will be happy. Now, one other thing I mentioned there was natural form. And I want to just do a sidebar here on what I mean by natural form. One of the ways that we create work for ourselves when we place plants into our plantings, particularly in our foundation plantings, is by not understanding how that plant is going to grow, what it's going to look like when it's a mature plant, and how it's going to be difficult for us to contend with pruning long-term for that plant to stay in the position that we first planted it in. So here's an interesting silhouettes of different types of plant forms. And this is just in the gene pool of the plant, it's how it's going to grow naturally. So you can see that if you have a tall, narrow space, you want a plant that is tall and narrow. There are plants that are called columnar. There are plants that are called pyramidal. A columnar plant is going to stay relatively thin from base to tip. A pyramidal plant is not. It's going to widen as the base as it grows taller. There are lots and lots of trees that homeowners, they look wonderful in the garden center, and you can think of just where you want to put them, but the mature height and spread of that plant is not generally noted on the plant tag, and it's very wise to actually look up what that plant looks like when it's mature. We have a lot of plants that are called dwarf plants, and that's misleading. They don't stay small, they just grow slowly. So be careful when you're looking at that information, and it's always wise, if you like to use the internet, to type in the name of the plant that you're interested in and then write mature and click on images and see pictures of that plant and how big it gets so that you can really understand what that means. And one of the best examples of that is that beautiful little dwarf Alberta spruce, which you can buy at around the holidays in a nice little container. It looks like this beautiful baby little tree, little evergreen tree. It's a dwarf Alberta spruce. It comes from Alberta, Canada, where it's cool and moist in its native habitat, and it just grows very slowly. But it doesn't stay small. It eventually will get over 30 feet tall. And people like to plant it because they think it's going to stay this little miniature tree, but it doesn't. And they tend to plant it in places that have a lot of reflected heat, and it comes from a very cool forest, and it has a lot of problems because of that. So match up where it grows naturally and what it needs with how much size your space is. So forsythia is another really good example of natural form, and you can see it in the upper right hand corner there in the picture. So its natural form is sort of fountain-like. It has a main stem at the base, grows straight up from the base, and then goes up and arches. So it's like the V-shaped plant there in the bottom, but it has this beautiful arch. It goes up and it arches. Now, because forsythia is a quick-growing plant, a lot of times people like to use it as a hedge. But in reality, hedges are high maintenance choices because you're going to have to keep pruning them back into shape. So you are building in a lot of chore task when you choose a hedge. Hedges also have to be placed just right because you don't want a south side to your hedge and a north side to your hedge because no light gets to the north side. So on the north side of the hedge, you see right through it to the back side that's facing the sunlight. So they need to be situated so that they're receiving light on both sides. So make sure you don't have a due north facing side to your hedge because it will never be able to fill out properly. They also need to be narrower at the top than they are at the base in order for them to stay thick all the way through from top to bottom. And you need to pick a plant that grows in that shape. Forsythia is actually not that plant. Forsythia is this V-shaped plant. Its top will always be wider than its base, so it will always be shading out the bottom part of the plant. And it grows very fastly. I think I made a new word. Quickly. And every time you prune it, because it has these single stems that grow up and out, you will cause it to grow many new growth stems at the point where you pruned it, which means it now gets heavy. It's got 5 new branches where it used to just carry 1, and it will start to open up in the weight of that. The snow lands on it and exacerbates that problem, and the plant can splay because of it. So I think it's a great plant. I personally prefer it to be pruned to match its shape, which is to take out the oldest stems at the base and allow it to do that big, beautiful open weeping. And that's the way to make your forsythia a lower maintenance plant for you, because that's how it grows. And then you're working with its natural form. So I hope that makes enough of an example of the difference between working with the plant's natural form versus having to contend with chores that are created when you don't. And I do actually talk a little bit more about that when we talk about additional plant forms later on. Are there any questions on that in particular? Because I know that can be confusing. Whoops, I skipped past something on you here. I'm clicking on 2 things. Okay, so edging is something that I would recommend that actually can reduce chores for you. While initially defining your edge between your lawn and your planting beds is a lot of work, it's a heavy task. If you have an edge between your lawn and your ornamental beds that you can mow right alongside. So that could be a sunken edging that your lawnmower wheel can ride along, or in this case, it is cut with a spade and then touched up with the weed whacker twice a year. In order to make this work, this is the hard part about this, what you're actually doing is you're air pruning the lawn. So it's kind of hard to see from the picture, but when you cut the edge, you cut away with a spade, and then you want a little bit of a gully so that the lawn is higher than the mulch where the two meet each other. That way, the grass roots don't have anything to grow into. They're kind of cantilevered over the mulch in the air, and that way they don't grow into the mulch. Then the mulch itself starts low and makes a little bit of a berm. So as you're driving along with the mower or walking along with the mower, if you happen to shoot any weed seeds into the bed, they're hitting that little berm of mulch where they're going to stay there, desiccate, and die. They're not going to germinate because they're exposed to too much heat and they'll dry out. That's a properly edged, if with this using a spade, edging that's going to help to reduce your weed whacking task. You will still need to clean that up because you're still going to have sprawling grasses that grow in there and it can look untidy, but you won't have to do it every single week. And you turn your weed whacker down and cut right along that edge to keep it clean. It's the establishment of the edge in the first place that's the hard part, but this is a great recommendation because it kind of defines where the mulch needs to stay, where the lawn needs to stay, and if you can afford to hire somebody to come and do your mulching for you or mowing for you, this is a great way to keep that clean edge and not have to keep coming through and getting weeds to germinate. It's really important that you're kind of creating a barrier for your lawn to stop and for your weeds that inadvertently are going to, weed seeds that are going to inadvertently end up in the bed to get caught somewhere. So if it's done properly, it can really help out. I like this picture because it's kind of a good example of what can cause you problems down the line that initially looks well done. So my next recommendation is to define your planting areas and combine plants into larger planting areas rather than having a lot of smaller beds. And part of the reason for this is because when you don't have a deep area and you're mowing along it, the entire planting bed is going to be susceptible to debris from mowing in the first place. And that's why I chose this image. You can see that that planting area is not very deep. On either side of the fence, it's not very deep, which means it's going to be susceptible to crabgrass or any other weeds that are in your lawn getting shot out of the mower across the entire surface area of that mulched area. The other reason why I chose this is because this is another right plant, right place circumstance. I love this fence. I love this idea. The plant that they chose here is called a zebra grass, the one that concerns me, and that is the grass that has that neat sort of yellow flecking in it. That plant grows 6 to 7 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. The area that they've given it to grow in means it's going to come out the other side of the fence, and it's going to go all the way to the edging of what they've created here for a bed. You see that ornamental edging. And there's a lot of herbaceous plants. Those are the plants that have green stems. All at the base there, lots of perennials, which are going to completely get crowded out as that large grass consumes that space. Grasses are fantastic ornamental plants, but their way of growing, if you think about where you see tall grasses growing, picture a prairie, picture a meadow, they are a colonizing plant that take over a very large area. That's just how they grow. A lot of our ornamental grasses also will die out in the center. So you'll have this mammoth, gorgeous 6-foot tall plant, and now the center starts to die out. Grasses by nature create very, very deep root systems. Some of them are 5 feet deep in the soil. So in order to solve the die out problem in the center of the plant, you need to divide it. So picture the chore of digging out a 7-foot tall ornamental grass like this to be able to divide it so that the center is not dead and the plant is not splaying, right? That is a chore you would need a backhoe to be able to do, and the plant will probably go on both sides of this fence. So this was a design choice that that looks great when you first put it in, but down the road is not taking into consideration the mature size of that plant and the amount of opportunity for weeds to get into this bed because of its narrowness. I have a neighbor that was a good friend of mine, and she had lots of small beds like this size, maybe 2 feet wide, and she was suffering from not being able to keep up with the weeding. And so what I did to help her with that was I said, let's pull all of your irises and your spiderwort was another plant that she had. Let's move them up into one planting area near the front of your house where you sit on your porch and you can see them, and reduce them from this area that was around her fence and just leave it open to mowing. It was actually less chores for her because she still had the same plants, but they were all moved into one big bed where she could tend it all, and that bed was on the other side of her walkway, so it was not being impacted by any flying debris from her lawnmower. And that really reduced the amount of time it was taking her to keep her weeds out of her planting beds. So flying mowing debris is a way to, thinking about that when you design your planting spaces is really helpful for not accidentally creating more tasks for yourself. And plants in a larger area have a bigger impact in terms of design. You can place plants in more interesting combinations, and it just has a bigger impact when you look at the garden. My next recommendation is to understand the relationship between trees and grass species or turf grass species that we like for our lawns. So I had just mentioned about grasses and where they grow in their native habitat. So if you picture grasses growing in wild spaces, you're seeing meadows, right? You're seeing prairie. When you picture trees, deciduous trees in particular, trees that drop their leaves and start fresh every year, making new leaves, growing in their native locations, what do you see there? You see lots of trees, but there's not a lot of grass. So grasses, turf grasses, in order to grow well, require lots of sunlight, and then you have a nice thick cover of grass, and they don't generally have to deal with leaf litter. Meadows don't have a lot of trees in them. They have mostly grasses and other flowering plants that grow in combination in that community with the grass, not really any bigger than the grass in a lot of cases. And trees in the forest are very used to their leaf litter falling back down to the ground and actually returning those nutrients back into the soil to feed the tree for the following year. So it tends to be a more friable, leaf litter dense habitat for them. So they're not used to growing to each other in their natural habitats. Their needs are different. The tree provides too much shade and too much root competition for the grass, and the grass, on the other hand, the types of products that we're putting down on our grass, like herbicides to keep the weeds out, are detrimental to the tree. So the best way to keep trees and grass happy in your lawn is to understand that they don't generally grow in the same places, and so to try to create a line of demarcation that allows them each to have what they need, but not to compete with each other. Trees are much happier to have some mulch at their base around where their canopy, at least where their canopy goes, and then plants that grow in combination with trees, such as ferns and sedges and woodland herbaceous plants. And the grass doesn't want to be impeded by lack of sunlight, lack of the ability to get to sufficient moisture. And so that actually makes for a happier relationship between the two. So if you can place your trees along the edge of the woodland, if you're fortunate enough to have woodland, and if you're going to place a tree on its own in your lawn, if you can give it some mulch area and provide to it the types of plants that would grow at its feet in the forest, then they're both going to be happier, and they're both going to require less inputs on your part to supplement the things that are missing because they're competing with each other. So that's a recommendation or a thought I would give to people when they want them both in their yard. Many people contact the extension service with screening. They want to put up a plant screen. And my first question to them is generally, do you require that screen all year round? Or only like around your patio when you're going to be using it when the weather is warmer? Because truthfully, plants that drop their leaves or deciduous shrubs generally grow faster, and you'll have more options for screening material that's going to grow quickly and give you that screen sooner and more effectively, and that you can manage and prune to kind of keep it in the allotment of space that you want it to have, than evergreen choices. And so you see here in this picture, this beautiful lace cap hydrangea. This is, you know, what a gorgeous plant. And many people are really seriously stuck on having an evergreen screen, and there are some problems with trying to choose evergreen plants in all of Sussex County. Some of our biggest problem are our deer population. There aren't a lot of evergreen plants that the deer aren't going to be really happy to take a bite of over a winter time. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. And many of our evergreen plants that can grow fast enough to create a screen have a growing tip at the top, an apical dominance. They grow from the top, which means they're not going to stop. They're going to just keep growing taller and taller and taller. They're going to get to the height you wanted, and then they just keep going, whether or not you have the space for that, which means the base of the plant is going to keep expanding too. So I created sort of a tongue-in-cheek example here for you in terms of screening examples. So arborvitae is a very fast-growing evergreen tree. And because it's fast growing, it's relatively inexpensive too, because if you're the garden center, if you have to take care of a plant for a very long time, you're investing your time and money into it, and therefore it's going to cost more to sell it to someone, because it takes a long time for you to grow it up to sellable size. So lots of people love arborvitae. I love arborvitae. I love the way they look. They grow very quickly, some varieties up to 3 feet in a year, but they don't stop when they get to the height that you would like them to stop at. So in this example here, we have maybe 15 or more arborvitae lined up nicely next to each other. They're looking beautiful in this picture. They've clearly been topped off already, because you don't really see a point at the top of them. Somebody has pruned off the top to round them out. But that plant will grow 40 to 60 feet tall, which means at the base, each one of those will be more than 15 feet wide. And have they allotted for that to occur in this picture? And no, they haven't. They've created an instant screen with this plant that looks good now, and 5 years down the road is going to have been planted too close. The trees will compete with each other. They will be dead material where they've butted up against each other because they're not getting any light, so they're not going to create any foliage. They've topped them off already, which means when you cut off the top of a plant that has that single point at the top, that apical dominance, the plant tries to do two things. It tries to create a new top, but you now have a whole open area where there's no foliage. The snow falls down inside there. Many arborvitae have multiple stems, and they will splay open from the weight of the snow. So you're creating a problem for the plant because its natural form sheds the snow, but when you cut off that top, it's now open and all the snow falls inside it, and it just will start splaying. They'll compete with each other. Some of them will survive, some of them will die. Now you have to replace the ones that died with something that's about the same size, but it's all this massive roots. It's very difficult to do. So on the left-hand side, you have a plant that's going to keep growing. And on the right-hand side, you have a fence or a trellis or screening that you've built there, which will be the same height and width as the day you built it from the beginning till the end. So sometimes the best screen is one that you build and then you plant on or around, because that gives you the screening you want instantly at the size you want it to be always, and it's there year-round for you. So think very long and hard about what kind of an investment it is to begin with. I know sometimes it's less expensive to purchase the plants than it is to build the fencing, but over the time, it actually turns out that the plants are probably going to cause you more labor and problems down the road if you've chosen a plant that is not easy to keep at a smaller size. There are some plants that are more easy to keep cutting back, but a plant with that single growing point is not going to be one of them. So keep that in mind. Sometimes a stronger investment with more money up front for a fence or a trellis is actually going to serve you better down the line than a group of plants. So now we're going to get on to some plant choices, and if you take that PDF file, it's actually got a link to this nice website from University of Massachusetts, Trees, Shrubs, and Vines for Low Maintenance Landscapes. This was one of the best lists that I found when I was doing some research on this presentation, and everything on it, because it's hardier to even colder zones than the one that we live in, will be hardy in your garden as well. So it's a particularly nice fact sheet. So again, that's in the PDF file, so if you can copy that PDF file in the chat box and use it for yourself, you can get to it there, or you can also email me if you want me to send it to you. So when we make plant choice considerations, there's some things I want to go over, and then I'll actually give you out some plants that I thought in particular that I have experience with and I think are some good choices, some good workhorse plants. When you're thinking about tight spaces or screening, there are lots of plants which are called fastigiate and columnar, which are upright forms, that make great choices for screening. But think in terms of not just evergreen plants, but also plants that drop their leaves, as long as you have unlimited height. Small understory trees fit into lots of different kinds of garden sizes and tend to be easier to work with because they're smaller and they don't tend to outgrow the space, because in their role in the plant community, they already grow underneath the canopy of larger trees. So that's how they're going to stay. So think about using more of them. Shrubs that have lots of stems at the base that can take heavy pruning are plants that are great to put in an area where you can come back and prune them if they really hard if they start to get too large for the space, because their natural form allows you to work with them that way. Evergreen plants, we'll go over some. A lot of them grow slowly, but they don't stop growing, so we need to keep that in our mind when we place them in the first place so that we can plant them and they can stay there for a very long time. That is reducing the amount of heavy chores that you're going to have to come back to in terms of having to move something that no longer fits. And then there's just a couple of warnings about making sure that you look up information about the plant to make sure it's not susceptible to some disease, insect, or deer browse. If you have to be concerned about that in our area, there are some things we do need to be concerned about right now that will just cause you problems down the line. So if you can avoid them by having that education ahead of time, that's really helpful to make a good plant selection. So fastigia is just such a wonderful word. A fastigia plant is a plant that has branches that slope upward. And so your height to width ratio is relatively 10 to 1. Columnar is also another term that you'll hear, but a columnar plant can be wider at the bottom to top, so the ratio is 5 to 1. So on the left-hand side, this plant is actually a variety of one of our native species of juniper, and that's what we call a columnar plant. It also happens to grow in a fastigiate manner. Its branches do go up. On the right-hand side of the picture, you see there is a sweet gum that also happens to be a native species that has a very columnar form and fastigiate forms. Its branches are very tight to the tree. Now, not every tree that we call fastigiate is going to have a point like that particular plant does. A lot of the deciduous plants that drop their leaves like that sweet gum there don't necessarily all go to that point like a pencil point like that plant does there. Some of them are more splayed open at the top, but the neat thing about fastigiate trees is that they will grow taller, and you can have that. You can really lift the canopy so that it's a tall exclamation point, and it will stay tall as long as you have that unlimited space above it for the height for it to grow on. So that gives you the opportunity to plant something that starts out maybe in a screening, but then it ends up as it gets older with more of the trunk showing, but you don't have to take the plant away because you had the space for it to continue to grow, which is a neat way to think about adding plants so that you don't have to change it. They're great for tight locations, provided your height space is unlimited. They look really neat in the landscape as an exclamation point because they literally look like that. And there's lots of varieties and a lot more varieties coming along. So you have lots of choices in your local garden center for those types of plants. Understory trees are trees that naturally grow smaller in the landscape. Their role in the plant environment is to not be the big canopy tree like your big oaks and your big maples, but to be the next level down. And they generally, at maturity, are not much larger than, say, 30 feet. Some of these are larger than others. And that means that they're easier to place for most home ornamental gardening purposes. You don't have to worry that that tree is going to get so large that it's going to threaten danger to your house in a storm, for instance, because it just doesn't get big enough at its maturest point. A lot of these trees in their native habitat, because they're understory trees, are not full sun trees. They're usually growing in part sun locations, and that's something to consider when you go to place them in your garden. I see many people, and you notice it's missing on this list, that plant Japanese maple trees as a specimen tree in a full sun location. Japanese maple are very much like dogwood. They in their native habitat, they grow in moister part sun locations, and they actually suffer from sun scald, from too much sun in exposed locations. So take a look at where they grow in their native habitat. I'm going to teach you how to use a fact sheet to find that information before you decide, if your space lines up with what their needs are. Carolina silverbell is absolutely one of my favorite beautiful trees. It just is not much used, but it puts out these gorgeous bells of flowers in the spring. and they're hanging down, so you look up underneath the tree, and it's just a beautiful tree, but it does require acidic soils, and it will not do well if you do not have an acidic soil. So that's something to understand about your soil, so that you know whether or not it's going to line up with the plant's requirements. There are lots of different kinds of crab apples that have beautiful flowers, and robins in particular love crab apples that will come to them after the little fruit has frozen and thawed a number of times in the wintertime before it's palatable for them. Dogwoods are beautiful species. We have the native Cornus florida and also the Korean dogwood Cornus kousa. Cornus florida does not have the same kind of fruit. It's a native plant, and honestly, a lot of the fruit will be eaten off it before it even has a chance to drop. It doesn't drop fruit. It's not something you have to really worry about placing over a walkway, whereas Cornus kousa gets rather large fruits that you want to be concerned about in your placement, so you're not placing it over a walkway or a driveway where the fruit is going to drop and get mushy and create a problem for you, a cleanup chore. So make sure that's something you look at too with the flowering plants. Make sure that the fruit isn't going to cause you a problem, or even petal drop. Some of our flowering species drop a lot of petals. Because I was choosing plants that are low maintenance, I also kept the flowering cherry off of here, because flowering cherry doesn't necessarily live for an extended period of time. It's not something that you would plant and then walk away from, that I would consider a low maintenance plant. And I left the Japanese maple off of here because it's shown up on our emerging invasive species list. So I don't want to leave you with a plant that's going to spread plants off into wild spaces. That's not a low maintenance plant. Our eastern redbud is an absolutely gorgeous understory tree. In its native habitat, it grows in part shade. It will have larger foliage and more of an open form in shade. You can grow it in more sun, but then it will be a more compact, smaller leafed tree. It flowers very early in the spring and on bare branches, which makes it particularly beautiful. And there are a lot of varieties that you can purchase now with different foliar colors. So that's very lovely. Ironwood is a native plant that's really mostly, I think most people don't really even recognize it, but it's in the beech and birch family. It has beautiful yellow foliage. It doesn't really have a flowering that you would notice, but it's a well-behaved understory tree. If you like beech and birch with very small leaves, in terms of reducing your maintenance, if you pick plants that don't have large leaves that you can just mow over the leaf litter and it kind of disappears, that's lowering your fall leaf maintenance cleanup. Serviceberry is another native plant. It produces fruit, but the fruit gets devoured before it gets a chance to hit the ground, so it's not going to cause a problem for you in terms of cleanup. Seven Suns tree, Heptacodium, is just an absolutely gorgeous all-around tree. It is not a native plant, but it has beautiful four seasons magnificence. Just its bark is gorgeous, its flowers are gorgeous, its seed head is gorgeous, and it's a small understory tree, so it's not going to outgrow a space. The magnolias do prefer acidic soils, and these two are the smaller flowering varieties. The big Magnolia grandiflora I did not list on here because it will cause some maintenance chores for you. Its petals are so huge, and it drops absolutely everywhere, which means it can create slippery conditions for your driveway, and you have to clean it up. So to me, that creates a chore. So it didn't make the list. But here's just some examples of things that I think would be useful and can be reliable placed properly. Here's some hardworking plants that are multi-stemmed shrubs that can take pruning, and we're talking here about plants that drop their leaves. Deciduous plants, we'll talk about evergreens in a minute. Azaleas are part of the rhododendron genus. and they can take pruning, and they have beautiful spring flowers. You do have to be careful about your azaleas when you're in a deer browse area because the deer will browse them. Carolina allspice is a very underutilized shrub, has a beautiful scent. That's where its name come from. The flower is not so, it looks like a dried flower when it comes out. It actually looks like it had already dried up. Like it's interesting, but it smells absolutely delicious. And it's a well-behaved plant, and it can take to pruning quite well. It also is relatively deer-resistant plant, so it's a good choice. Fothergilla, there a larger one, Fothergilla major, and the smaller variety, Fothergilla gardeni. Very pretty plant, has a bottle brush flower, and has lovely fall foliage. Hydrangeas, there's so many different kinds of hydrangeas. I'm particularly fond of the oak leaf hydrangea, which is a native plant that has leaves that look like an oak and has beautiful fall foliage and a white panicle, but there are lots of different kinds of hydrangeas, and they are long-lived shrubs. You put them in the ground and they might outlive you. They're very reliable. They do tend to grow larger than people expect them to, so look at their mature size before you place them. People have a tendency to want them to stay smaller. They can take pruning, but with the hydrangea, the trick to pruning is to prune it immediately after it's done flowering so that you don't accidentally cut off next year's flowers if you're trying to keep it at a reduced size. Lilac is a good old reliable shrub. It can take heavy pruning. You prune back the oldest, biggest stems, and it breathes new life in the plant. Again, another long-lived plant. Ninebark is one of my particular favorites because it has so many different foliar varieties, and that's what the picture is there. That particular one is a large growing variety that has very dark foliage, and what you're seeing in the picture are the seed heads. So the stems exfoliate. They look like cinnamon sticks. So it has interesting bark. It has beautiful different foliage choices. They come in a large size and a smaller size depending on the variety. And they all flower and then have these beautiful seed heads. So it's a hardworking plant when it's put in the right location. And it does tend to like a little extra water. But there's so many different varieties that you can choose from, especially if you're looking for some change in not just green foliage. That's a really interesting shrub you might want to take a look at. And there are some smaller varieties, just like lilac. There are smaller varieties, so you can get the large old-fashioned varieties and you can get the smaller varieties. Good, hardworking, long-lived plants. Summer sweet flowers in the summertime, and it's a beautiful vanilla honey scent. That's unusual. Most of our flowering shrubs are going to flower in the spring, so that's a nice addition. It's semi-deer resistant. It depends on the, the deer tastes in your deer population in your area. I found for my area in Sparta, the deer were happy to eat it, but other people have told me they've had success with it being left alone in their yards. Spirea, we have native and non-native varieties of spirea. Comes in lots of different foliar colors. Great plant, and it takes to pruning very easily. Same is true of St. John's wort, Hypericum. Flowers a little later than other shrubs, which is nice. Big, yellow, puffy flowers that the bumblebees will absolutely thank you over and over again. They adore them. Can take really heavy pruning. Hardworking plant. If you like seeing plants volunteer and start from seed in your yard, it also can seriously volunteer all over your yard if you like that. Mine like to show up all sorts of different places off of my main shrub, which I appreciate. I want that to happen. So if you're looking to create kind of a self-sustaining, self-sowing shrub, that's one that will happen for you. Viburnum, lots of different varieties of viburnum, some native, some not, some more susceptible to deer browse than others. Some have really beautiful fall foliage. They produce fruit. Their birds will thank you if that's in your yard. And then last but not least for sure is Virginia sweetspire, which is a native plant which has beautiful fall foliage that rivals the burning bush. Burning bush, unfortunately, is on our invasive species list. So if you're looking for some red fall foliage in a shrub, Virginia sweetspire is a good choice. Very good choice. It's a good replacement and can take pruning. So for evergreens, I've kind of created two different lists. One is those things that do have central stems that really require careful placement and pruning to respect that. And then the other will be those things that have multiple stems that are easier to prune and recover from. So arborvitae, as we saw in that screen, is one of our central stem tree forms and really are best respected as keeping that original form so that they can be allowed to grow taller and wider, and that when you place them that you allow for the fact that they're going to grow to the mature height. The plant in the picture there, a juniper, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Juniper columnar varieties are also great varieties for their upright growth that you want to treat this way as well. You want to make sure that they are given mature space to be able to grow to their best. I'm going to suggest that the columnar varieties are probably the best behaved and therefore lowest maintenance, because you don't have to worry about accommodating for the rest of their size. The picture there is a false cypress. It's a Chamaecyparis genus, and I chose this one in particular because I think this one gets placed, it's a fast-growing evergreen, so it's relatively inexpensive. You can buy it in lots of garden centers, and it just has that beautiful lacy, drippy foliage, and it left to its natural form and growing the way it normally would grow, it actually gets to be tree size. It gets to be understory tree size, like 30 to 40 feet. I think most people don't realize that with this plant, and they plant it in front of their foundation and it gets bigger and wider. It is not a columnar variety, it's a pyramidal variety. It's very wide at the base. Before I moved into my house, somebody had planted a whole row of these, and they're now all of them 30, 35 feet tall and probably 20, 25 feet wide. It is not a narrow plant. So plan for that when you place it, because its foliage is prettiest when it's not pruned, because when you prune it, you lose all those gold tips off the edges and you lose that lacy impact. I see people pruning it hard to keep it because they like the foliage color, and you can do that, but you're going to be recreating lots of pruning chores for yourself if you want to try to keep it in a different shape than the way it naturally grows. I spelled Hinoki cypress wrong here. I just realized. I apologize. I've written Hinkoki cypress instead of Hinoki cypress, so forget that first K. It shouldn't be there. That's both the Chamaecyparis are not that I'm talking about here. The false cypress and the Hinoki cypress are not native plants, but they're very well-behaved plants. They are very reliable plants. They take a lot of they can grow in a lot of different soil types. They're forgiving plants. So they are what I consider low maintenance plants. We have some species of pine and spruce that grow very, very large. So be very sure that you're looking at the mature height. There may be varieties that are more columnar varieties or more fastigiate varieties, and those would be the better varieties if you're trying to place them close to your house. Try to make sure if you place plants close to your house that they're not going to grow too large for the space, and then you're going to be sorry that you chose them, because removing them is a very large maintenance task that you'll be setting yourself up to. So evergreen plants that are multi-stemmed or lower growing and therefore easily contained or pruned are this group here. I think most people are probably familiar with Andromeda. Lovely part shade plant, it really needs to be placed in a part shade location or it will be susceptible to diseases and insect infestation from the stress of being in too much sun that it just doesn't have to deal with if it gets more moisture and more shade. It just doesn't want to bake all day long in full sun. It does need a break from the sunshine in order to look its best and to grow properly. Good old bird's nest spruce, lovely plant, slow growing plant. It will expand with age, but it doesn't grow particularly tall, but it will get wider. Boxwoods are wonderful plants. They can be pruned in all, they take pruning so well. This is why they're a standby in the gardening industry. We do have a couple of insect species and diseases now that they are susceptible to that we didn't used to see so much in our landscapes, that they're more active now. But if you need a plant that has evergreen and you need to be able to continually prune it to keep it in a certain space, there really isn't any replacement for boxwood. It really is a very hard-working plant in that circumstance. Many species of holly also can be grown and successfully pruned. Hollies tend to be larger. They're wider and larger forms. Many holly species can be grown either as a tree or as a shrub. You need to make that choice when you purchase the plant and decide which way you want it to grow in your landscape and stick with that. Once you've cut it into a multi-stemmed plant, it's not going to make a good-looking tree, and you can't really take a plant that you've allowed to have a single stem, lop it off, and expect it to make a really good-looking shrub. So you need to make that choice up front, but there are holly species are flexible that way, which is unusual. Japanese plum yew is a plant that is very deer resistant. You can get a variety that's more of an upright variety. It's a vase-shaped plant, so it's thicker at the top than it is at the base. That's its natural form. There's also a variety that grows in what we call a prostrate manner, which is along the ground, and it's a very beautiful, hardworking, again, prefers a little bit more of a part shade circumstance, but beautiful, effective plant. We have many varieties of multi-stem junipers, some of which are native and some of which are introduced. So there's lots and lots of choices there, and they're very hardworking plants and they can handle pruning. You do need to look at the form in which it grows and then make sure you're pruning it to accentuate that form and go with that form rather than create problems. And that varies depending on the type of plant, but if you have any questions about that, that's what the extension is there for, so I can help you figure that out. Dog hobble is a terrible name for the plant, beautiful plant. Leucothoe is its genus name, which is just as difficult to say anyway. Works great in moist areas, is a very deer resistant plant. There are a number of different cultivated varieties of that. It's not highly used. It does complain if it doesn't get enough moisture, and it's a part shade, I want some extra moisture plant, but give it that and it is just a hardworking, beautiful plant, has an unusual form. It's, as its species there kind of indicates, it does kind of have this fountainy kind of form and an unusual foliage. It's what we call a broadleaf evergreen, like Andromeda, like rhododendrons, so it stays evergreen, but it doesn't have needles, so it's an interesting form, and its new foliage comes out a paler shade of green, so it's very pretty in the spring. Its stems tend to be red. It's a very pretty plant. If it has enough moisture, it will complain to you if it does not, so make sure you place it properly. The mucopine that I'm recommending here is the one that's in the picture at the top there. That's called a mops mucopine, and the reason why I personally happen to love mucopine, I love its shape and its form. It's different and unusual, but mucopines are slow-growing plants, but they can get really large given a lot of time. And so the mops variety is a much daintier, slower growing, going to stay in a smaller space. So I see muco pine planted. It's absolutely beautiful, but it can turn into this like 15-foot wide mammoth. This mops is smaller, and it won't cause you that. It'll take longer to fill up more space, and it won't get that huge. It's a little easier to place. Rhododendron, native plant in our area. There are also some varieties that are non-native. Rhododendron itself is not a small shrub. If you see it growing in the wild, it actually tends to be like, it looks almost like a multi-stemmed tree form up to 20 feet tall and wide. So if you want a form of rhododendron that's a more manageable size, that's going to stay smaller and be easier to prune, that would be your PJM rhododendron, which I featured in the bottom picture there, that beautiful lilac-y purpley pink color. That's how it flowers in the spring. It's a more delicate size of rhododendron, easier to place and easy to prune because it doesn't get so large. Rhododendrons do actually respond really well to heavy pruning. Whenever you're going to heavily prune a shrub, you don't ever want to remove more than 1/3 of the plant at any one given time. But rhododendrons actually do respond really well to heavy pruning. They will even sprout new branch growth on trunk-sized stems, which is unusual. So they really can respond well to pruning. If you have a really overgrown rhododendron and you want some help on bringing that back into a more manageable size, please email me, send me a picture, and I can help you figure out what to cut and when. And it's a lot less work to cut back a big shrub than it is to try to dig it out and replace it. And then the last plant I mentioned here is Russian arborvitae, which is the middle picture there, that beautiful feathery bluish foliage. It does turn sort of purpley in the winter cold. It protects itself with a chemical, that anthocyanin, that makes it look more reddish, just like trees that go red before they drop their leaves. So it has that protection. Junipers will do that too. They tend to turn a little bronzy purpley to protect themselves in the cold. But it's a low growing evergreen, prefers part shade, beautiful feathery bluish accent plant. It will expand widely, but you can cut it back to keep it to the space that you want to have it in. So just a beautiful choice. When it comes to herbaceous plants, which are plants where the material dies back to the roots stay viable in the soil, but well, for things that are perennials, the roots stay viable in the soil, but the plant regenerates and all of its material is green material on the stems and squishy stems versus your woody stems of your shrubs. I didn't have a whole lot. There's a few that really stuck out to me as 3-season plants, sometimes 4-season plants that really work hard in the garden. And so I limited my recommendations here to those because they require divisions and they're more high maintenance plants in my world. If you have some areas that you really want to devote to herbaceous plants, I can help you figure out for yourself which plants would work best for your particular area. But here's some real workhorses as far as I'm concerned. Good old blue star Amsonia. This is a plant that flowers little blue flowers in the spring, and in the fall its foliage would turn yellow, and the foliage stays clean, and the plant never looks spent. It's a hardworking perennial insofar as it always looks fresh. The foliage always looks fresh, and then it gives you that little kick of fall color of turning yellow in the fall. So that's particularly nice. It does spread slowly over time. The clump gets wider and wider, but it is a hardworking plant, and the deer leave it alone. Coral bells, Heuchera is the genus. That's the picture that you see right there. And it comes in many different varieties of foliar color, and it's semi-evergreen. Like parts of it will stay there through the winter, which is nice. Usually a lot of our herbaceous plants just completely disappear. I see a question in the chat, and it's the perfect question to talk about when I get to the next plant here, which is daylilies. The one daylily I would recommend is a hardworking daylily that the deer will not decimate on you. The deer love to eat your daylilies when they first come up, and then wait until the flower buds are just about going to open, and then they eat the flower buds too, which is really, really sad because you're waiting for that flower and the deer eat it before you get to see it. But the exception to that is the Stelladoro daylily, which is a lower growing, lower stemmed, bright yellow flower. It'll flower in the spring, but it will rebloom late in the fall. So that's really the one I would say is you plant it and it's your lowest maintenance circumstance. However, as the question in the chat is asking, when do you divide herbaceous plants? It will expand, and it will get to the point where you might have more than you want in a certain area, and at that point you would need to do some divisions. Now, herbaceous plants and divisions is actually rather tricky question because there are always exceptions to every rule in terms of dividing plants and how they're divided. So how the root system of the plant grows and the type of root system the plant has is going to dictate how you divide them, and their life cycle sometimes is going to dictate when you want to do that. So you would need to want to look that information up, and Denise, I can specifically answer. Denise asked the question, which species of plants that you're talking about that you want to take care of and worry about that on, because that really is plant specific. But in general, divisions are best done when the plant is going to suffer the least amount of stress from having had that happen to it. And in terms of replanting, some plants, when you divide them and replant them, they tend to look a little cockeyed for the rest of the season, and other plants don't behave that way. So it's going to depend on how the plant behaves. But really, the spring and the fall are the times when we look at dividing herbaceous plants, and mostly that's because that's when we have ample rainfall, so that when they go through this stress of being taken out of the ground and then cut and replanted, they receive sufficient moisture to make up for the moisture that they lost through that process and the stress that they went through. We don't want to additionally stress them. So it's going to be different for different plants. I would say avoid doing that in the summertime. You don't want to do that in the summertime anyway because the soil is so hard, it's hard to dig anything out. So early spring and early fall are the best times to go through divisions for the plant's sake and replanting. Foam flower is similar to coral bells, like the picture there. There's lots of different varieties with beautiful different foliar colors, and they may or may not be deer resistant in your area. That's going to depend on your own deer populations. They were not deer resistant in my area, but other people are. They're not high up on the list for the deer singular there to devour. So that's going to depend on your deer population. Peonies, though the weight of the flower will cause a crash on the plant. The reason why I put them here is because peonies can outlive people. You can get a division, a root from your mother that was passed from your grandmother. The plant just has longevity in its gene pool, and it has beautiful foliage that stays beautiful even after the flower is gone. So the peonies, we have bred them to have these really heavy flower heads if you're using the herbaceous species. So it makes sense to grow them through a ring so that the weight of the flower doesn't make the flower crash over. But there are also varieties of peonies. They're called intersectional peonies that are half woody, half herbaceous. They're more like a shrub, and they don't flop over like that. They're expensive, but they act like a shrub. So there's a lot of different varieties of peonies to choose from, all different sorts of colors. They're a beautiful cut flower. They have a lot of fragrance, and a lot of longevity, and the foliage stays clean for the whole season. So that's why they made the list. Lenten rose, evergreen foliage, really super early flowers, and then the flowers just sort of dry up like a seed head that looks like it's still a flower for a very long period of time. And evergreen just is why they're making the list here, and highly dare resistant. So good hardworking plant. The only two bulbs that I noted on here were alliums and daffodils, because as far as critters leaving them alone and planting them and them living on, they're really the easiest bulbs that we have for choices out there. There are others, and if you're particularly interested in bulbs, I can help you choose ones specific to where you have what your site conditions are, if you're interested in that. So allium's the flowering onion. Those are the round, tend to be in colors of purples, pinks, and whites. And because they're in the onion family, they are left alone, even though pollinators absolutely adore them. And there's lots of different varieties of daffodils. My suggestion to people on daffodils, because both alliums and daffodils, in order for the bulb to re-energize to flower the following year, you want to allow the foliage to stay green and die back on its own. So in daffodils in particular, if you have lots of daffodils, the foliage tends to flop, and that tends to bother people. So because it just doesn't look that attractive. So the best way to deal with that is either to plant them in concert with other plants whose foliage is going to hide that. Daylilies and daffodils work well together, because the daffodil is done and the daylily comes up. They both have strappy foliage, and it just sort of camouflages the circumstance. The other thing you can do is buy shorter varieties of daffodils. They have smaller flowers, but they also have smaller foliage, and that falls away easier. It's easier to cover that up, and you don't notice it as much. So that's two ways to not end up with that situation where you've got all that floppy foliage and you wish you weren't looking at it. Grasses are sort of tough to make choices on, because they grow very deep roots. A lot of our ornamental grasses tend to die out in the center after quite a few years, especially if they're growing in really high nutrient dense soils. They grow fast, they expand fast, and then they just die out in the center, which means you have to dig them up and divide them, which is really, really difficult to do depending on their size and the depth of their roots. It's also genetically keyed into them to spread effectively by self-sowing. So wherever you place them, they're going to spread their seeds, and they're going to self-sow, and they're going to do it really effectively. A lot of our ornamental grasses are prairie grasses. They compete really well in the prairie. They're fire adapted, so if you put them into your compost pile, they're just all happy that they're ready to germinate as soon as you put that compost back on your garden. So keep in mind that that's what's coded into their genetics to do. If you love ornamental grasses, it's wise to clump them in a planting with each other, so that you're not running into that circumstance and making a choice of those that aren't going to get so large that they're going to create a problem for you down the line. My neighbors planted a very large ornamental grass, and they ended up bringing in a backhoe to dig it out and replaced it by putting in a tree in the hole that was left because of this very problem. It ended up to die out in the center, and then the whole thing was splayed open with this dead spot in the center, and they hadn't realized that would happen. So I'm making a recommendation here from the one little grass that I know, ornamental grass, that does not behave this way. It's called prairie dropseed, and it's in that picture there at the top. It's growing, what you see in the background is Baptisia false indigo, which is a native plant. And it's a beautiful, very fine, looks almost like a horse's tail or horse's mane plant. It stays very low to the ground. It's maybe a foot tall. It'll put up a seed head that's very airy. It's not really ornamental for its seed head. It's used for its foliage. But it looks almost, it moves in the wind. It looks almost like water. Very, very pretty, low-growing plant. The reason why I recommend it is because it does not die out in the center. It has a lot of longevity, and therefore you can plant it and not have to divide it and worry about it. Also, sedges are what I would suggest for use. Sedges are actually woodland grasses. They tend to grow in part sun locations. Some grow in very sunny locations. Some are actually from very wet habitats. And they're just a smaller version and therefore easier to place and move in your garden. So they can act as a lower growing type of ornamental grass. There are native varieties and non-native varieties. They come in different foliar colors, so they can be easier to use, easier to be able to manipulate in terms of chores, for garden chores. And then I'm particularly fond of ferns. When you choose ferns, if you want to place it and not have any expansion, then you want to choose a fern that's called a clumping type of fern. Ferns come either as a clumping type or as those that have rhizomatic roots that will spread and colonize. So those that you want to place and know that they're not going to take over an area that you don't want to designate to them are the clumping types. The picture here is a Japanese painted fern, absolutely beautiful variety. And interesting foliage color, great in part shade or shade. Most plants prefer more sun rather than less sun, and most plants will grow larger and with a more beautiful foliar and flower display if they're flowering plants in more sun rather than less sun. For plants that are shade adapted, you just need to make sure they have enough available moisture if you're going to put them in more sun. Christmas fern is an evergreen fern. It's a native fern. So the interesting thing about that is it's a clumping type and it stays evergreen. So it has that four season interest. So it's an interesting choice in the landscape to give you some evergreen that stays low and is well behaved. So when you're using annuals, I actually happen to prefer annuals and feel that for me, annuals are lower maintenance for a pop of color in a well-placed location than trying to work out 4 different perennial plants to share a space to have flower color all the time. So I think that annuals that are placed in window boxes and containers or in areas that you've left as a focal point near a walkway, near a patio, near your front entrance, near your mailbox, where you want an interesting pop of color, annuals can actually be your best choice and least amount of work. Then if the rest of your garden is basically trees and shrubs that are well edged and mulched regularly, then tending to picking out your annuals and planting them in a few choice places is actually a higher impact, good looking ornamental garden than all the hard work that goes into managing perennials. Perennials really is a high time labor task. So annuals, on the other hand, you can choose a couple of plants, try some this year, you want a different color choice next year. If you like to change things up, if you move your furniture around a lot in your house, annuals are going to be more your type of plant. You can also set up irrigation on timers, so if you don't like watering your window boxes or your planter boxes, you can have that already set up. The neat thing about annuals is that when the season is over, the plants tend to shrivel up to basically nothing. You take away the material that's left, dump out your old soil, clean out your containers, put them in the shed, and everything's cleaned up and done. You're not cutting back lots and lots of stems from a large perennial garden that now you have to mulch or compost or find a place to place them to put the perennial bed to sleep for the dormancy period. It's less work to have a few well-placed annuals either in containers or just in certain areas that you've designated in your planting beds. Some annuals like the white flower that's in this picture here, that's called alyssum, will self-sow if they like the area that they're in and they have seed to soil contact. If you want your annuals to self-sow, you need to allow the seed access to your soil. If the seed sits on top of mulch, it's likely to desiccate. If it can touch the soil and the rain is going to push it down into the soil, then you do have a chance that the seeds will self-sow. Keep in mind, if you have open soil, there's a chance of any seed to self-sow, not just the ones you want. So that's the trade-off that you have to make there. Some other plants like marigolds that are in this picture, you can collect the seeds and use them again the following year. So it depends on the plant. Some of the patented plants won't start from seed, so it depends on whether the seeds are viable or not, but that's something that you can look through when you're interested in choosing annuals, and I can help you with that if you have specific questions regarding that, or that's information you can look up on for specific plants. I personally really enjoy window boxes because the front of my house is really flat and it allows me to see the hummingbirds and the butterflies and the bees active on the plants as if they're inside my house. So for me, watering and fertilizing my window boxes is not something I consider a high maintenance chore, but that's going to be a personal thing for you to choose for where you want to spend your time in your garden. So there's another consideration, and I'm going to give you a way to look for this information, but there are some plants and there are some circumstances that are issues that are active in our county that it's important to be aware of. So you want to be sure that you avoid plants that are prone to current insect pests and diseases and deer browse. If you live in a high deer density location. If you have a fence, then you don't have to worry about the deer. That's great. You can make your choices without that in mind, but you're going to be very disappointed if you're making an investment in plants and then the deer eat them down to nothing. A point about deer I always like to make is that any plant, no matter whether or not it's on the deer resistant list, that has been recently transplanted is at risk of being eaten by deer because the plant is too stressed to be able to protect itself from deer browse. It takes plants up to 3 years to send their roots outside the zone that they were growing in the pot that you transplanted them from out into the native soil. Some plants grow quickly, some plants grow slowly, but until that plant is self-sustaining and has grown new roots and new stems and new leaves, it can't actually turn its energy use to the chemicals that it uses to protect itself from being tasty for deer browse. So that means that any plant that you invest in, if you live in a high deer density location, you should protect from deer browse for at least the first 2 growing seasons, 2 years that it's in the ground. The more money you spend on it, the longer I would protect it. In my garden, what I do that I find is the most effective is that I actually buy the wire garden fencing that's black. It's practically invisible from a distance, and I put in one garden stake, and I make that deer fencing around it, that garden fencing around it, and I leave it there. What I have found for me is that that doesn't collapse under the weight of snow. It doesn't trap birds. It doesn't trap insects. I don't have to go back and keep adjusting it or fixing it. And it just protects the plant from having to deal with the constant pressure of things nibbling it again and again and again until either the plant is been in the ground now and I'm not providing it any supplemental water, and it's got enough foliage to fend for itself, and it can start defending itself chemically, or it is grown above the browse line so that there's enough percentage of the foliage to keep the plant alive and keep it growing. So for instance, in my garden, I have some winterberry holly that I kept protected for a very long time because even though it's not a technically a high browse plant. It is in my community, and now it's tall enough that I took away the fencing and the deer browse the bottom, but the top is fine. So that's just my suggestion for a way to protect your plants that doesn't require you to have to constantly fix it. I found in my garden that when I used the netting, the ice weighed it down, and the poor butterflies and dragonflies only knew to fly up, so they would get caught in the fold and they wouldn't be able to get themselves free. And I had to let too many insects and birds free from the netting that had gotten trapped in it because they couldn't see it, where I never had that problem with the wire. Sprays can work, but you have to be really diligent about constant reapplication with that. So you're just going to have to figure out what works in your particular area with your population of deer, because that varies from population to population. The picture I have here for you to look at is the hemlock woolly adelgid. Hemlock was left off my list because it has this problem and because we know that this insect is active in our area. And if you choose a hemlock, you are going to have to protect it and have some management in mind for keeping it safe from this pest, because we know this pest is currently active and is really decimating populations of hemlock. Hemlock is a beautiful plant. It's shade tolerant. Like holly, it can grow as a tree or a shrub. It's a wonderful plant, and it's really too bad that this is a circumstance that we have to contend with right now, but we do. Also in our area, we see a lot of a disease called cedar apple rust, which is shared between species of juniper and plants in the rose family. There are lots of plants in the rose family. A lot of our flowering trees are in the rose family, like crab apples are in the rose family. So unfortunately, the disease is harder on the rose family than it is on the junipers. The junipers can handle the component that they have to deal with this disease cycle, but the rose family suffer a lot. So if you have a lot of juniper already on your property, I would advise you against choosing a plant in the rose family, because that's just going to cause that disease to have full cycle in your area. So it's something to just avoid. So if you have any concerns about that, you can speak to me about what's already growing, and I can help you figure that out. And what I would suggest when you start to make your plant choices is two things. One, make sure you look at what the mature size of a plant is going to be before you decide that that's something that's going to work in your garden. And the other is that you learn this neat little trick about looking for what we call fact sheets. And that's the terminology that you want to use when you go online and look it up on the internet. So Rutgers just put out this new fact sheet about hydrangeas in the garden. So if you want to look for a fact sheet on a plant you're interested in, you type in the plant name and follow that with the words fact sheet. And what that's going to pull up for you is everything that's written by a university based on research, as well as some .gov sites and some organizational sites. Botanical gardens are great organizational sites that will have information, and they will explain what the plant needs to grow well, what their soil type that they require, the moisture level, the amount of sun that they require, any diseases and pests that they're prone to. And this information is going to be your base to find out, you know, is this plant suited to growing in my location? And will it be a successful choice? And is it a long-lived plant? What are some typical problems that there are with it? When do I need to prune it? What do I have to worry about that are going to be problems with this particular plant? Do those problems exist in my garden? Some fact sheets will tell you the plant will not tolerate wet soils. Some fact sheets will tell you the plant has to have acidic soils. The situation with the soil is that plants are adapted to grow in the areas that they have evolved to grow in over hundreds of thousands of years that those plants have been alive on our planet. And if blueberries are a good example, blueberries need very, very acidic soils because that's where they have evolved to grow. So if you don't have a highly acidic soil, blueberries are going to suffer, because even though the nutrients are in the soil, the plant can't uptake those nutrients because the pH is not allowing that chemical process to occur for that plant because of where it evolved. So that goes both sides. Some plants will suffer in acidic soils that are adapted to alkaline or more sweet soils, and vice versa. It's also true for texture in the soil. Some plants grow in very sandy soils. There's a lot of air in sandy soils. Sandy soils tend to be very low in nutrients, and there's not a lot of water in that soil. So plants whose roots are adapted to grow in nutrient-poor, very dry soils will drown in very wet soils and don't grow well in very, very nutrient-dense soils. So sometimes too many nutrients is too much of a good thing, and it's not good for the plant. So fact sheets are going to help you understand what the plant needs. You got to take a look at what your site conditions are like, and then you can match the plant to the space that you have available for them, and then you're going to have a success with the least amount of work on your part in the end. So hopefully I haven't overloaded you with too much information. Here is my email address to contact me. I am working remotely right now, but that phone number will get you into our office and they will transfer you straight to me. So you can reach me that way. If you do call me and you leave me a message, the number that's going to come back to you will say restricted because I'm working remotely. So if you've left me a message, keep that in mind. It's me trying to get back to you. Emailing me is usually the best way to reach me because then I can send you resources and fact sheets and more information. So I have a question about organic veggie gardens and where do I look to treat the soil to reduce recurring weeds? So the answer to that question that came in was actually what we figure out with that is first we identify which weed that is the problem in your soil. Then we can figure out what are the best tactics to deal with that particular weed. Sometimes weeds can actually be an indicator of a circumstance in the soil, and sometimes adding amendments to the soil will actually reduce the habitat that's making it good for the weed and bad for the vegetables. So what we first have to start with is identifying the weeds. So if you could send me pictures of the weeds, I'm going to really need the best way to identify a plant is to have the leaves, the roots, and the flowers in the picture so that I've got the most amount of chances of being able to identify what I'm looking at. But you can send me what you're seeing now if it's in your garden right now. If you can send me email me a picture, that would be the best way to start with that. Also for anybody, if you don't know what your soil pH is, Rutgers Soil Lab is the best way to go to do a soil test. You can go online to the Rutgers Soil Lab and download their form. It has instructions on how to go about taking your soil test, and then you mail that back to them, and then they're going to email you the results from that. And if the results come back to you and you're not quite sure how to understand what they've sent to you, I can help you figure that out and tell you what all that means. All of our soil tests that are taken, a copy goes to your local extension, so your ag agent has a copy of it too, and they can help you, or I can help you figure out what that means and what you need to do about it. So soil tests are a great way to find out what your baseline is in your soil and what you're working with. You want to take a soil test not anywhere near when you have put down fertilizer or some other amendment, because that's going to skew the results. So the fall is a great time to take a soil test, provided you didn't just put down some fertilizer or you didn't just incorporate some manure or something like that. So at the end, when you've harvested all your vegetables and the vegetables have depleted the soil, before you go and put anything into it, that is the best time to take your soil test, because then you'll get your recommendations back and you can work in the right amendment, and it'll have the whole winter time to reboost. That soil will be all ready for growing in the spring. Are there any other questions?
Thank you so much, Lisa.